Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of A Week in Watches, which is a weekly look back at news, stories, releases, and various other things from the world of watches. I'm your host, Ollech Wajs. Thanks a lot for joining me. This week we have a pretty diverse show from Seiko to Urwerk and some other things in between. If you find the episode interesting, informative, please do like and subscribe to it. And if you happen to be listening to this in podcast format, give us stars and a rating if you can. It's very much appreciated. Before we get to the news, we actually have a couple of sponsors this week. Which I'm pretty excited to tell you about. It's October, which means that Wind Up Watch Fair New York City is right around the corner. It's happening October 21st through 23rd. That's Friday through a Sunday. This show is going to be absolutely incredible. We've had many incredible shows this year, first in San Francisco and then Chicago, each getting bigger and better. But New York is going to be the biggest one yet, the biggest Wind Up Watch Fair we've ever thrown. Has over 60 brands. There's going to be panels. There's a bar. It's at a new wonderful venue, the Altman Building, which is located at 135 West 18th Street. The fair is free and open to the public, so bring your friends, bring your family. It's just going to be a good time. And if you would like to look up all the brands that are there, and as well as other details, check out windupwatchfair.com. One more bit of news is that this week at the Wind Up Watch Shop, we launched the Zodiac Super Seawolf GMT Blueberry Limited Edition. This is the newest version of the Super Seawolf GMT, which is a recreation of the 1960s aerospace GMT. Think the Super Seawolf dive watch, but with a GMT bezel and a fourth hand for travel and dual time. That is a limited edition of 200 watches and is available exclusively at windupwatchshop.com. So if you're interested, check it out there. And now on to the news. Seiko goes cave diving once again. Seiko, you probably heard of them. They really don't need an introduction at this point. I think if you've gotten far enough to watching a YouTube show about watches, then you're a fan of Seiko, or at least have come across them. I know I like them. They make a huge, diverse range of watches. Some hit for some people, some hit for others. They tend to be very niche, particularly their dive watches, and this week's release, I think, is no different. So recently, they've been doing a lot of limited editions and exclusives, and this is no exception to that. This is a trio of U.S. exclusives that are inspired by explorations of the undersea world, in particular caves and cave diving. So think blues and greens, really, pretty stuff. But also terrifying stuff. I just like to say cave diving is one of the single most terrifying concepts that I personally can think of. But what's not terrifying are dive watches. So luckily we don't have to go there. So the watches that are released are 3 new Shogun models, obviously in the Seiko Prospects range. The Shogun is a fairly aggressive and large dive watch that has been around since, I believe, 2008. There's been a few versions of it. Not sure if this is 2 or 3 at this point. It's got a noted hard line case with really strong facets, particularly on the ends of the lugs. They sort of just like cut off really harshly. And then otherwise it just, it looks like a dive watch. It's got a crown of 3. These ones have cyclopses. They have big arrow hands. It's an appealing looking watch, certainly, and has a cult following. All 3 of the new ones feature titanium cases as well as titanium bracelets with Seiko's hard coating on it. I believe they call that Dia-Shield, so they'll be nice and scratch resistant as well as light. They all feature matching gray and kind of black bezel inserts. Couldn't quite find the insert material, but it does look like it's an aluminum to me. And they are, they're sizable watches. So these ones come in at 43.5 by 51 by 13.25. So what sets these watches apart is that they have 3 distinct dial colors, obviously, and they utilize a pretty interesting texture. So it has a sort of a linen-esque texture, which I think is supposed to have a sort of almost like crystallized look to it in this context. And the colors are meant to evoke, and I quote, changing tones of mineral and stone deposits on cave walls. The 3 references are SPB 349, which features a pale green dial, SPB 351, which is a light blue and gray dial, and SPB 353, which has a teal dial. Now, when I first saw these, I have to say it immediately jumped out to me that the green and the teal dials in particular were very similar in color to the Genbi Valley Grand Seiko limited editions from last year, which I think is pretty interesting and as an owner of the 277, one of those models, something I'm not mad about because they're really beautiful colors. The green and the teal that they got out of those are really exceptional. So it's actually, I think, kind of nice to see it in a new context and, in a completely different model. Inside of these new cave diving watches is the Seiko 6R35, which is to be expected. And they are priced at $1,500. So once again, the Seiko Prospect line jumps up a little bit higher in price. You'll need a compass to find this new Ollech Wajs. It's been a while since Ollech Wajs launched their last watch. I believe it was actually almost literally a year ago. It was a destro design that was a collaboration with some sort of military motorcycle company, had an olive green dial. It was very nice looking. We've discussed them before, actually, when they did a little campaign around graphics, but they're a Zurich-based brand that's been around since the 50s, but was revived a handful of years ago. They make modern tool watches with fairly decent specs to them, Swiss made, obviously, and they're inspired by the archives of the brand, and they, will show you sort of how each watch is based on something from the past. So this week they announced the M110 model, which is a dive field hybrid watch with a compass bezel. And this was designed to sort of speak to the brand's legacy of being used by military, particularly in the 60s. But interesting though, with that note, it's also apparently the first compass dial that the brand made. So interesting little twist there. Anyway, the watch itself is quite nice looking. It features a soft gray dial with dive markings on it, though I did notice that the triangle at 12 also had the dots on either side, so maybe that's a little hint at pilot watches as well. Imagine a compass would be useful for a pilot too. Has two tones of lume on the dial, a white and a sort of a teal lume. It's a very nice combination there. And it has I would say is their signature handset. It's not necessarily the most unique handset. It's just like a blocky hour and minute and a arrow-tipped seconds hand, but it is very similar to what they use across all of their watches, which sort of ties the whole family together. So it's definitely their style of handset, if you will. The dial also features an outer index that has 3-minute markings at each quarter hour. So the chapter ring turns from sort of white to sort of that teal lume color for 3 minutes at each quarter hour. And this is a reference to radio silence periods, which is another military nod. That's when there will traditionally be radio silence in order to pick up distress calls. And there are like radio room watches and clocks that you can find throughout history that have similar markings. The standout, obviously, of this watch is the bezel. It features a fully brushed steel design with a very intense index with lines every 2 degrees, numerals every 20. It's really very finely grained and printed, so it has this look of a real precision tool to it, which I have to say is quite appealing. And then it has big, thin letters for the directions at north, east, west, and south. The case is a new design for modern Ollech Wajs, but it is an old design from their catalogs once again. So this is where the dive element comes in. It is actually based on a skin diver design from the 1960s. It's very classic looking 60s diver. It's sort of a generic barrel with closed off H lugs to it. It's all brushed steel. It's 300 meters, and it measures a very specific 39.56 millimeters by 47.5 millimeters by 12.5 millimeters. So fairly nice proportions on there. Probably a little larger than the original, but in that kind of nice medium Goldilocks zone for a modern diver. Powering it is the new Soprod Newton P092 movement, which is a slightly more luxe movement from Soprod, who has been sort of filling the space left by ETA and even Sellita as they've gotten more popular. We've seen this movement once before on a Seiko watch, and what makes it interesting is that although it is used, as in place of a 2824 or Sellita SW2200, it is not at all a clone of that movement. It actually features a full a full balance bridge on it, which is supposedly better for shock absorption. In the case of the Ollech Wajs, also features a customized rotor, to their specification with their logo, though I believe this does have a display case back, so just your watchmaker will get to enjoy that. The price of the M110 is between 1,456 and 1,596 Swiss francs, which is around $1,460 to $1,600. And that is on a mesh bracelet and some sort of strap that they're being very coy about and not revealing quite yet. The watch will be available later this year. This is where this gets weird and why you might need a compass to find it. And there's no landing page on the website either to go and look at it. Instead, if you want to see the watch, you're going to have to go to their Instagram account at Ollech Wajs and stay tuned for an update there, because it's not available yet. So check it out when it is. Urwerk wants you to live long and prosper. Urwerk, everyone's favorite high-concept, sci-fi-inspired race car-priced watch brand, has launched a new model inspired by live long and prosper. This is the thing. I think this is one of those things that not everyone can do. I'm not sure. I can do it. So it's actually nicknamed the Spock, and having gone to Urwerk's headquarters in Geneva, or at least their store there, which has some level of atelier in it as well, they have a little museum upstairs, and on the wall are various, Star Trek paraphernalia. It's actually very endearing, as this brand, though making very, very, very high-end watches, is really run by some enjoyably dorky people, which, is just endearing. But back to the actual release. So Urwerk is a brand that's sort of known for their complicated displays and the kind of over-engineered mechanics behind them. In particular, they're known for wandering hour displays, which is a really cool complication that generally features, and it's a bit hard to describe, though it visually makes a lot more sense, an hour attached to either a hand or a satellite of some kind that will feature the numeral of the hour. So it says 1, and then it'll trace an arc of a minute hand, and then the next number will come up. That could be the entire 360 degrees of the dial, in which case there'd be one satellite, but often you see 3 to 4 satellites, I guess most commonly 3. It's a really fantastically cool complication that often involves some level of animation of these things flipping to the next number, just visually interesting and very different from a classic 3-hand watch. Interestingly, there's different ways of doing it. We've actually begun to see a lot more affordable watches with them as well, doing it in a very simple manner. But then it obviously goes up to the extremely expensive as well, such as, frankly, the watch we're going to be talking about today. It is a concept that also dates back to old clocks. Once again, at Urwerk's headquarters, they have some of these old inspirations that date back hundreds of years. And I believe the first watch, though, that used it, I might be wrong about this, is the Audemars Piguet Star Wheel, which is a really beautiful dress watch that had 3 or 4 translucent little satellites with numbers on them going across the dial. That said, Urwerk does it their entirely own way, and the 120, or the 120, is an evolution on the previous version, which was the 110, which was sort of a staple of the brand that had been around for, I think, at least a decade. It won a GPHD award in 2011. So the following up of that design is a big deal for the brand. It's really an evolution of sort of a core model. The 120 bears a distinct resemblance to that watch. The case shape is sort of similar, though really wildly different when you look at the details of how it's constructed. But the similarities sort of stop there. And the most interesting thing about this watch, and why the live long and prosper symbol is involved, the satellites, after arcing across the minute hand, sweep around, and the numerals split open like a V, like this, and then rotate independently of each half, forming the new number as they go. It's really insane. It's just crazy engineering on this tiny little level. It's really novel for, it's just all about the show of it all. And just, the fact that they can create such outstanding things. The case design is frankly also equally gorgeous. It's super futuristic looking. It's made out of steel and titanium. It's all gray, has cool looking articulating lugs. The case back sort of comes up around the side and locks into the top, so there's no screws or like notches in the top of the case. Every angle of it has something interesting going on, and when you look at it, it doesn't really look like a watch. It looks like some sort of other industrial item, perhaps even something from a sci-fi film, some sort of, piece of dangerous equipment even. It's large. It measures 44 by 47 by 15.8 millimeters, but according to the press release, they did actually focus on the ergonomics of this watch compared to the first model. So it has these articulating lugs, so it can kind of sit on the wrist better as the strap will pull down the side. Look at the photos we put up. Go check it out for yourself. This is just an incredibly impressive and bizarre and fascinating watch that once again really kind of puts this sort of endearing nerdiness of this brand at the forefront and into the world of luxury, which is probably not normally found. The watch is, of course, priced accordingly to the level of complexity in this movement, and it is around 100,000 Swiss francs. All right, now it is time for the release of the week. Benzinger carves out a new watch. I'm very excited about this one. This sort of popped up on Instagram the other day. I immediately reached out to the brand, and well, now it's the release of the week. And we can look at that. So Benzinger is a brand that I think isn't super well known in the States. It's a German brand. It's independent. It's small. It is helmed by Jochen Benzinger, I hope I said that correctly, who obviously the brand takes his name, who is a master craftsman. The brand specializes in extremely sort of traditional timepieces, though I'd say with a flair for a certain modernity in its coloring and use of certain styles and textures, but they often feature, or mostly feature, guilloche dials that are hand-turned on a Rose engine by, I believe, Mr. Benzinger himself. If you're not familiar with a Rose engine, I mean, this is in a guilloche. This dates back to, the 16th century and 17th centuries. It was used by Breguet and contemporaries on watches and clocks at that time. I believe Fabergé was like an expert at it, and it uses this really cool lathe that features what I believe are called rosettes, which are sort of wheels that feature geometric patterns in them, which move the lathe in certain ways to create beautiful patterns cut in at very, very high precision onto tiny little surfaces, in this case, watch dials. It is machine assisted essentially to get the precision, but this is all executed by hand. It has to be turned by hand. It has to be monitored very closely. It's definitely a real skill, and something that takes a hell of a lot of patience. Additionally, they feature heavily engraved movements, all done by hand, I believe also by Mr. Benzinger, according to the videos on their website that I saw. This is an extremely slow and painful process that is, done through executing, through small tools and gouging out metals to create beautiful little intricate details and patterns. It takes a ton of skill to do. And then they also are known for their skeletonization of dials and movements, once again done by hand. So this involves drawing out a design on a movement, boring little holes through a plate, cutting it with a bandsaw, refinishing all the edges. It's just incredibly labor-intensive process to create fairly ornate, but very traditional and just very high craft watches. They're known for their regulators, using a lot of off-axis hour and minute dials. These are a pretty cool selection of movements, from Unitas to actually vintage Patek and Vacheron movements as well. And they also take on a lot of customization. As you can imagine, this is the sort of thing that is made to order. So if you're looking for something specific, I believe you kind of call them up and you can tell them and work out the watch you want. There are also watches that are available sort of as standards. And despite the level of craft that I'm explaining to you, the level of just sheer hours put into the watches, they actually are relatively reasonably priced, or more reasonably priced than you would expect. I mean, brands that do similar things charge high five figures for such things. Benzinger watches start at around 8K, and they don't go all that much higher than, like 15 or something like that, from what I could tell. Expensive, but incredibly high value for what you're getting. Anyway, this week they announced a new line that features their first sort of proprietary movement and a stunning design that hints at past master watchmakers. It's called the Gap 1, which stands for German-Austrian Partnership. They make a note that name is actually sort of outside of the norm of their naming conventions, but they're very excited about the fact that Benzinger German teamed up with Hebring 2, who we discussed in another recent episode, to develop their exclusive movement that they're using in this, and Hebring is Austrian. The movement itself has fairly standard specs. It's 28,800 beats per hour, 48-hour power reserve, 19 joules. It's manually wound, and it features actually an Austrian Karl Haas balance spring, which means it's an entire German Austrian movement, which I think is part of the pride there. It is regulated to within chronometer spec, and features sub-seconds and a pointer sub-dial. The movement has been decorated to the nines, as they say, in-house. It has gold plating, black rhodium plating, flame blued parts, tons of beautiful engraving, and it's also heavily skeletonized, so it looks like a series of overlapping rings, and those rings are colored differently to give this really cool 3D effect. Which, absolutely gorgeous if you're into that kind of thing, which I apparently am. While the movement is extraordinarily impressive, it was really the dial that stood out to me and grabbed my attention. So it's a guilloche dial made out of sterling silver with what is called apparently Breguet frost, which is I guess a sort of light white kind of coloring to it. It features an off-center hour and minute hand, which are just a little bit north of the center of the dial towards 12, an index of Roman numerals on a surface that has been sort of left unengraved from the guilloche, but given a slight brushed finish to it almost, that is interrupted by a sub-second dial at 7 and a pointer date sub-dial at 5, which are matching in size to create this sort of perfect symmetry down the middle of the dial. On top of that are then interlocking golden rings, which I'm not actually sure if those are applied on top or if those are engraved in the process of the guilloche. But they look above the surface a little bit. The layout is absolutely beautiful, and to me immediately evoked the works of George Daniels, particularly the anniversary watches in the style of this, who we also once again talked about a few weeks ago on a different episode, as well as of course Breguet design. So just have the more contemporary icon, and then the originator, the Uber icon Breguet. Super traditional looking, but absolutely just stunning. It's housed in a 39mm case that has an off-center crown that's up at 2, but then a pusher for the date at 3, which has little guards around it. The look of this watch, the size of the case, the movement in it, I just could imagine it's absolutely stunning on the wrist. It's mounted to a gaiter strap as well, which seems, like the right choice for something that's so, deluxe and delightful. When I saw this, I obviously expected it would cost something quite frightful. However, it is actually 11,900 euros, which is currently 11,690 USD because the euro is a bit weak to the US dollar currently. So once again, expensive, but just this insane value for what you're getting, and for the aesthetic that you are able to achieve at that price point. It's really wonderful. If you want one, you have to order them directly from Mr. Benzinger by going through his website. I believe you might even email him and request this. And it has a 7 to 8 month delivery time because these are largely handmade. And that's it for episode 18 of A Week in Watches. Thank you so much for joining us. Please head to wornandwound.com daily for news, reviews, and all other sorts of things about watches, and I will see you next time. Thank you.